Heather Vacek, the academic dean here at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. It's the second week of Lent, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation this morning with my friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Leanna Fuller, who is the Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care here at the seminary. Welcome, Leanna, for a conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
We have a number of things to talk about this morning. And so the first, I have a little bit of show and tell for.
Okay.
Your most recent book, When Christ's Body is Broken, talks about church conflict. And in discussing conflict, you talk about suffering as something that is an unavoidable part of human existence, but also something that can lead to a kind of healthy vulnerability. How would these kind of topics, suffering, vulnerability, be addressed throughout Lent in a kind of formative way for a congregation?
Well, I think there's a few ways that those kinds of things can be addressed, and I feel like a lot of congregations probably already do in some respects. But I think of things like liturgy, where those things can be lifted up and named very specifically, including in the prayers of the people, for example. I also think about preaching, how these kinds of things can be talked about in sermons and offered as theological reflection on suffering, for example, in a sermon. Certainly, I think other ways would include Bible studies that might focus on either these themes more generally or even specific kinds of suffering that people might want to explore, either through reflection on Scripture or book studies. So there are a lot of great books out there. You and I have talked about Richard Lisher's Stations of the Heart as a really powerful reflection on grief. I can imagine a book like that could be really interesting and useful for a congregation to engage together. And of course, there's lots of other topics related to that you could look for books on illness or violence or all kinds of other things. So having those kinds of conversations, I think, is really formative. And then for people who are directly experiencing those forms of suffering, I think congregations certainly could offer support in various ways, even support groups for those kinds of experiences, I think could be really helpful.
And suffering is something we each engage in our teaching. We had an academic term a few years ago when you were teaching a class on grief and loss, and I was teaching a class on suffering, and we had some folks enrolled in both. And so these are inevitable human experiences and important. And so I like these practices you've named that congregations, as you said, many congregations do these things really, really well. But there are always things to think about. Well, one of the other classes you teach here at the seminary, a very popular class, is a class on systems theory and group dynamics. And Lent, as a liturgical season, not celebrated in every congregation, but many congregations and traditions, is a shared experience, a group experience. And so how can experiences like liturgical seasons have an impact on group identity, on group formation?
Yeah, well, one of the disciplines that I engage in my work, not so much in the systems theory class, but in other places, and actually in my book as well, is social psychology, which is really a branch of psychology that focuses on our memberships and groups and how those group memberships really shape our identity in a very fundamental way, in a way that's very much as real as individual identity, we might say. So one way of answering the question about liturgical seasons is to say that when we participate in the observation of a season like Lent, we are reinforcing our group identity as Christians because we are thinking about our common story, our common traditions, these observances that we do together. And so that is sort of making our identity as Christians more salient in the moment. That's the identity that we're really emphasizing, as opposed to some other group identity we might bring with us, such as political affiliation, let's say. That would be an example. So when we're celebrating Lent together in a worship space or in some other context in the church, we're really emphasizing our identity as Christians and not so much whether we're Republicans or Democrats or independents, right? So those group memberships seem less important in that context. So that's one way I think we could think about liturgical seasons forming and shaping us, although that's not really their purpose in terms of, how they were developed, but I think it can have that effect.
Yeah, and I think that there's something, as you were talking, I was thinking about the way that people in general, but church people hold on to traditions so dearly, and there is something there about claiming that identity as a primary marker. And so it's not just about the tradition and the longing for something from the past. It's about what that does and knitting us into into a community.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And I was picturing groups of people who I claim and would claim me as part of a community, and thinking about the ways that I'm shaped and formed by them with some gratefulness for that, this place being one of them. So again, as someone who has written about and thinks about conflict and health, are there any practices for Lent, and we've talked about this a little bit, but any practices for Lent that you've seen be particularly life-giving for congregations or perhaps for individuals?
Well, I think there are a lot of practices that can contribute to congregational health, and I would say those practices probably can go on all year long. But they might be great places to sort of focus or emphasize during Lent. In my work on conflict, I discovered that congregations that provide a lot of opportunities for different members of different subgroups in a church to interact and have time together seemed to handle conflict a little bit better when it came along. And by subgroups, I mean, every congregation, I think, tends to split into smaller groups, whether that's groups that just naturally kind of work together on different projects, or many times it's by age in many of our churches. We have things split up kind of generationally. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but in my work I found that congregations that can do a good job of helping those subgroups interact, helping those members interact across those lines, sometimes they're called cross-cutting relationships because they show networks between all the groups in the congregation, they get to know each other better, and so then when conflict comes along, there's more trust, there's more sort of relational capital that's been built up, and so those kinds of things that form that would be, again, things that a lot of churches already do, spending time together in prayer, studying scripture, reflecting on books or other texts together, and service projects. Those are all the kinds of things that I think build relational health in a congregation, and they strengthen, I think, the congregation as a whole. And that makes conflict usually a little easier to deal with. It doesn't make it easy, but I think it makes it possible for congregations to engage those things in healthier ways. So
there's sort of some place to land, some points of connection beyond the conflict when it arises.
Right. Absolutely.
I was picturing a particularly nice church retreat as you were talking, a place that gathered people of all ages and formed some of those kind of connections.
Yes, absolutely.
So how about for you and Lent or Holy Week? Do you have a particularly favorite practice, something you've enjoyed or found really meaningful at some point?
Yeah, so I grew up Southern Baptist, which means that we didn't really observe Lent. I'm not sure I even knew what Lent was when I was growing up. So this has been kind of a tricky thing for me to figure out as an adult, because I don't have those formative experiences from childhood to sort of go back to think like, what was Lent, what did it mean for me growing up? So it's felt a little bit like adopting a season that I didn't have much familiarity with. And so for a number of years I tried giving things up for Lent, which is something that a lot of people do. And somehow it just never quite felt natural to me as a practice, I think just because I didn't grow up doing it, so it feels a little bit strange. So this year I decided to add something rather than give something up. And I actually added a couple things, but the main one was I decided to volunteer my time with an organization I've never worked for before for a cause I care about. Because most of the time I find it easier to give financial assistance to those groups than to actually volunteer my time, just because of my life and my schedule. But I thought this year I really want to make an effort to be present physically in this work that people are doing. So this year I decided to volunteer with the Produce to People program that's run through the Greater Pittsburgh Food Bank, and it basically just takes produce into communities all over Pittsburgh and lets people come and get fresh food that they wouldn't normally have access to. And it's been a great experience so far, and I'm sure that I'll keep doing it after Lent, but it just seemed like a good time to start, when I was thinking about what's something I could add that would seem like it would be life-giving and not just for me, but meaningful for other people. So that's what I'm trying this year.
That sounds great. I found I've really appreciated over the past couple of years conversations, mostly written about in blogs online, about people thinking about the right way to engage. Not right way as a prescriptive way to engage in Lenten practices, but a way to discern what feels right at the right moment. And so
Right.
this sense that it might be giving something up, it might be taking something on, and so I think that that's a great example. Well, we're going to turn now to one of the assigned texts for this coming Sunday, and it's Psalm 121. And in some conversation earlier in the week, you and I realized that we both claim this as a favorite psalm for a variety of reasons. And I wonder how you might imagine a group of people using this psalm devotionally during Lent.
Well, as I was thinking about this question, I thought about how for me one of the real themes of Lent is simply our human finitude and frailty. We began Lent on Ash Wednesday with having ashes imposed on our foreheads and hearing words like, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So we kind of begin the whole season with a very powerful reminder of our mortality, that we're not going to live forever, and there's really nothing we can do about that. You know, like we're creatures, and you know, we're finite, and that's not under our control. And so, as I was thinking about the psalm, I feel like there's a lot of resonance with that. You know, the psalmist is writing, I will look to the hills from where will my help come. My help comes from the Lord. So, I mean, there's a recognition there that I need help. I can't do everything by myself, and the Lord who created heaven and earth is the one who will help. And so I think that's sort of the psalmist's way of saying, I'm dependent on God. I can't do all of this myself. I have a way that I have to rely on God that's beyond me. And so I think for congregations today, for many of our congregations, I think this could be a really fruitful passage to explore together. My own sense is that in our culture, by and large, we don't so much, you know, emphasize dependence and rely on other people. We tend to emphasize self-reliance and being in control and independence and all those things. So in a way, it's really a countercultural message, I think, to say, you know, actually all of us are dependent. We all come from God. We all go back to God, as the psalm says, you know, our going out and our coming in. And so where are the places in our lives where we sense that vulnerability, you know, and where are the places that we could use that vulnerability as a way to connect with other people, right? Because I think the real danger of this sort of cultural insistence on independence and self-reliance is, first of all, I don't think it's even possible. I mean, I think we all, you know, depend on each other in really profound ways, but if we try to insist that we don't need those connections, then we end up isolated and we rob ourselves of intimacy, which is, you know, one of the greatest gifts of human life. So I think it could be really interesting for a group to engage this text that way during Lent, just to think about who we are as human beings and, you know, how we depend on each other.
Yeah, I like that. So our dependency, and there's one of my favorite phrases from the psalm is about God who neither slumbers nor sleeps, and so this sense that our dependency is on a steadfast God, and which gives us room, perhaps, to have that kind of vulnerability and intimacy.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Fuller, it's been great to be in conversation with you. Next week, join us again, and actually Dr. Fuller will be changing chairs. She will be here next week for the third week of Lent, and in conversation with President David Esterline, and I will be back in 2 weeks. So again, thank you for conversation. Thank you for joining us.